The signal came in like a whisper, almost imperceptible against the background noise of deep space. But Earth's most advanced algorithms picked it up, a repeating pattern too complex to be anything but artificial. The signal pulsed through the vast void of space from a point far beyond the outermost boundaries of human exploration, for a region marked only by darkness and uncharted anomalies. The message was clear. The abyss calls. Descend. Dr. Aidan Farrow, head of the Earth Space Exploration Program, stared at the decoded data on his screen. His fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant to confirm what he feared. The message was not only an invitation, but a warning, a cryptic, ancient cry from a lost civilization. The abyss, he muttered under his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. His team of researchers had pored over countless years of astronomical data, yet nothing had prepared them for this. This wasn't a simple anomaly. This was something much older, something sentient. Far beneath the surface of the Earth, inside a high-security facility, a select group of experts was convened. The news had already spread through channels known only to the highest echelons of government and military. A decision had to be made. Could humanity afford to ignore this signal? Or was this their chance to reach the next frontier of knowledge, to touch the unimaginable? Captain Erika Hall was sitting in her office aboard the Excalibur, Earth's newest flagship, designed for deep space exploration. She'd been chosen for this mission not just for her experience, but for her unparalleled instincts under pressure. The call came to her unexpectedly, a direct order from the highest authorities: lead a team into the abyss. She didn't question the reasons. Humanity was no stranger to risk. But as she stared out of her office window at the distant stars, something gnawed at her. There was something about the signal that felt wrong. The abyss wasn't a place they should venture into. It was too silent, too empty. When the orders came, Captain Hall gathered her team: specialists, scientists, and military personnel with the right blend of skills. The mission was top secret, no room for error, no time for second guesses. Everyone who signed on knew they might never return. There would be no heroic banners or medals at the end. The mission was simple: find the source of the signal, discover its true meaning. But no one knew exactly what they would encounter. As the crew gathered in the command center for their pre-launch briefing, Hall felt the weight of their uncertainty pressing in on her. She addressed her team, trying to project the confidence they would need, but even her voice wavered slightly. "This is not just about exploration," she began, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the men and women before her. "This is about survival. We have no idea what's out there, but the fact is, we're the first ones to answer the call. I won't sugarcoat it. This is a one-way trip. We go, we do our job, and we make sure humanity survives whatever we find in that abyss." The room was silent for a moment. Captain Hall knew that, beyond the technical and tactical discussions, there was something unspoken, an underlying fear. The abyss was a dangerous unknown. "And remember," she added, her voice steady but firm, "this is humanity's chance. We either become something greater or we disappear into the void. There's no turning back from this." The ship's engines roared to life, and as the Excalibur broke free from Earth's atmosphere, the stars outside shimmered, cold and indifferent to their mission. Hall could feel the weight of what lay ahead. She glanced at the viewport, watching as the blackness of space enveloped them. The abyss, the true unknown, was out there waiting for them. But what would they find when they arrived? Would they become the next victims of its consuming darkness? Or would humanity's ingenuity and will to survive overcome the unimaginable? As the ship hurtled toward the coordinates, the crew braced themselves. They were not only about to descend into an abyss no one had ever dared to explore, but they were about to uncover the forgotten truth of the universe itself. And that truth, they all knew, might be far worse than any of them could ever imagine. The Excalibur sailed silently through the stars, its sleek, advanced hull cutting through the darkness of deep space. For days, nothing but the hum of the ship's engines and the rhythmic pulse of the stars outside kept the crew grounded in reality. But as they neared the coordinates of the signal, a subtle shift in the fabric of space became evident, like a tremor in the very air, only there was no air in space. It was an eerie sensation, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Captain Erica Hall stood at the helm, staring out into the expanse. The crew behind her worked in quiet efficiency, preparing for the final leg of their journey. Their instruments were flashing, alerts flickering across screens, but no one spoke. They all felt it, the creeping unease that had settled over them since they crossed the threshold of the abyss. "We're entering uncharted space," Dr. Aidan Farrow, the mission's lead scientist, called from behind her. His voice trembled with an unspoken question. "The signal's getting stronger, but it's different. We're not sure what's causing the fluctuations. The pattern's there." Before he could finish, the ship lurched violently, throwing the crew into disarray. Alarms blared across the command deck as the hull groaned under the stress of an unseen force. The ship tilted sharply to one side, the gravity on board fluctuating, pulling and pushing the crew in strange directions. A deep, vibrating hum resonated throughout the ship, and for a moment it felt as if they were no longer in control of their own vessel. "Stabilizers offline," shouted Lieutenant Carson, the ship's chief engineer, as he scrambled to adjust the control panels. His hands moved furiously over the console, but the feedback was chaotic. "We've got power surges everywhere, and I can't isolate the source. Everyone, brace yourselves." Hall barked, her command cutting through the panic that was beginning to spread among the crew. "Steady, Lieutenant. We're not losing control today." The shaking continued, but Hall's voice remained firm, anchoring the crew as they scrambled to regain control. There was something out there, something invisible, yet omnipresent. The closer they got to the signal's source, the more intense the distortions became, as if the very fabric of space itself was unraveling. In the observation deck, Ensign Ruse stared out at the swirling void. His face, pale as the blackness of space, seemed to consume everything around them. "It's like the stars are dying," he muttered under his breath, barely audible over the noise of the ship. "This isn't normal." Farrow, clutching the edge of his seat, glanced at the readouts, his eyes widening with alarm. "This isn't just gravitational instability. This is dimensional warping. We're not in normal space anymore. We're in something else, something beyond our understanding." The ship lurched again, this time with a deafening sound that seemed to reverberate from the very core of the abyss itself. The crew was thrown off balance, struggling to stay on their feet as the hum of the ship shifted into a low, guttural vibration that seemed to rattle their bones. "Report," Hall snapped, turning to her crew with a fire in her eyes. "We've lost contact with the communications array," Farrow said, his voice tense. "The signal is coming from right below us, but it's changing." As the crew scrambled to regain control, the ship's sensors went haywire. A powerful pulse of energy washed over them, momentarily overwhelming their systems. The gravity shifted one last time, and the ship spun wildly, throwing the crew into weightless chaos. Then, without warning, everything stopped. A profound silence settled over the ship, as if the universe had exhaled, releasing them from the overwhelming force that had gripped them. The monitors blinked back to life, but the readings were incomprehensible. Hall gripped the arm of her chair, forcing herself to remain calm. "Where are we?" she demanded. "Coordinates are inconsistent," Farrow said, staring at the screen in disbelief. "The signal is directly below us. But we've lost all frame of reference. I think we've crossed into something beyond space itself." Ruiz, still staring at the viewport, gasped. "Look, there's something out there. It's not a star, but it's pulsing. It's the source of the signal." For a brief moment, Hall's gaze flicked to the screen, where a faint glow was visible in the distance, far darker than any star. It pulsed rhythmically, as though it were alive, drawing them closer with an invisible force. It was the abyss. And they were already inside. "All hands, prepare for descent," Hall said quietly, her voice a sharp contrast to the chaos they had just endured. "What we're about to face is unknown, but we will meet it head-on. No turning back." With a deep breath, she turned to her crew. The next stage of their journey was only just beginning, and already they were in deeper than they could have ever imagined. The Excalibur floated in the emptiness, the strange, pulsating light growing more pronounced as they descended toward it. The crew's eyes were fixed on the viewport, drawn to the ominous glow that seemed to beckon them into the unknown. It was like nothing they had ever seen, a dark, liquid pulse, moving in sync with their own hearts, as if the very space around them was alive. Captain Hall stood at the helm, her hands steady on the controls despite the deep unease gnawing at her. The ship's systems were functioning again, but there was no denying the weight of what they were doing. The abyss, an ancient, uncharted part of the universe, was not only a mystery, but it was also a potential graveyard. They had no idea what awaited them, only that this mission had been forced upon them by something greater than themselves. "Where is it?" Hall muttered to herself, eyes scanning the readings flashing on the console in front of her. The pulse was stronger now, overwhelming the ship's instruments, but there was something else, something they had not detected before. "It's not just a signal, Captain," Farrow said, his voice tight with the same tension that hung in the air. "It's a presence. Something is trying to communicate with us. But it's not using sound or light. It's manipulating space itself." Before Hall could respond, Lieutenant Carson's voice broke through. "We've reached the point of no return. We're in it now. Whatever this is, we can't just turn around and go back." The view from the observation deck had changed. The dark pulse was no longer just an eerie glow. It was now a massive, writhing form that stretched across the void, a shape too vast to comprehend. It was not a singular object, but something that defied definition, an ever-changing mass of shadow, light, and raw energy, shifting in ways that defied the laws of physics. "We should prepare ourselves for the worst," Hall said, her voice low but resolute. "Set course for the heart of the pulse. We need to understand what this is, even if it means risking everything." The crew nodded, but there was a heaviness in the air. Every single one of them felt it, the weight of being the first to uncover whatever secrets this abyss held. No one spoke of it, but they all knew they were at the edge of something that might be beyond their control. As the ship drifted closer, the pulse grew louder, an overwhelming presence that now resonated within their very bodies. The vibrations weren't just physical, they were psychological, deep within their minds. Hall felt it first, a subtle tug at the edges of her consciousness, as if something was trying to get inside her thoughts. She dismissed it at first, but as the sensation grew stronger, she realized that it was no accident. Farrow's voice came through the intercom, breaking the silence. "Captain," I think I understand what's happening. The pulse, it's affecting our brains. It's sending out waves, subtle signals. They're manipulating our perceptions. What kind of signals? Hall demanded, gripping the arm of her chair. It's not clear yet, but they seem to be, amplifying emotions. Fear, curiosity, urgency. It's almost like the abyss is alive, trying to communicate through our deepest instincts. Are we in danger? Hall's voice was sharp, her eyes never leaving the viewport. Not sure, Farrow replied, the concern in his tone evident. But we're being affected, all of us. At that moment, the entire ship shook violently once again, far more forcefully than before. The sound of the pulse reverberated through the walls, filling the Excalibur with a low guttural hum that was almost tangible. It felt like it was inside their bones, rattling their core. And as suddenly as it began, the shaking stopped, leaving an eerie, unnatural stillness in its wake. Hall's heart raced, but her training kicked in. Hold tight, everyone. This isn't over yet. Outside, the pulse had grown larger, an enormous, shifting mass of dark energy and distorted light. The Excalibur hovered just outside its boundary, the sense of scale almost impossible to grasp. Hall ordered the ship to approach, but the closer they came, the more intense the pull became. It wasn't just gravitational now. There was something else at play, something far older and more powerful. Whatever this is, it's not from our time, Farrow said, his voice shaking. This is beyond anything humanity has ever faced. Hall swallowed hard. She wasn't sure if she could keep her composure much longer, but she knew one thing. Whatever this presence was, whatever the abyss wanted, humanity was going to find out. And as the ship's lights dimmed, they began to hear a sound, a deep, resonant hum that filled their minds with something ancient, something terrifying. It was the voice of the abyss, and it was calling them closer. The next stage of their journey had begun. They were no longer in control. The abyss had them. The Excalibur trembled as it drifted closer to the pulsating mass, the dark abyss in front of them now a living, breathing entity. The hum that filled the ship's hull had intensified, weaving its way into the very fabric of the crew's thoughts. It was no longer a sound alone. It was a presence, an endless whisper in the back of their minds, pulling them deeper into its grip. Captain Hall gripped the arm of her chair, her knuckles white, as the eerie sensation washed over her again. It was like a constant pressure inside her skull, as if the pulse of the abyss was trying to decode her thoughts, to make her understand something that no human mind could. She wasn't the only one feeling it. Her crew, once focused and determined, now seemed distracted, their eyes glazed as they struggled to fight the subtle influence of the dark force before them. "Captain," Farrow's voice came through the intercom, trembling but clear. "The signal, it's getting stronger. Whatever this is, it's alive. It's communicating with us. I can feel it inside my head." Hall turned sharply to look at the scientist, her mind racing. What does it want? Farrow hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an answer that was just out of reach. "I don't know. It's trying to make contact. But not in any way we understand. It's like it's trying to use our emotions, our fears, to speak to us." The hum reverberated through the ship, louder now, like a pulse of energy that vibrated through the bones of every crew member. The walls felt thin, as though the vastness of the void outside was inching closer, threatening to engulf them. Hall felt a cold sweat bead on her brow. The Excalibur had entered an unknown realm, one that defied every law of physics they understood. "We need to pull away." Carson's voice cracked as he worked frantically at the control panel. "We can't survive this. The ship." Suddenly, The ship lurched again violently. The entire crew was thrown from their seats as a wave of force swept through the Excalibur. Panic flared in Hall's chest as the instruments flashed with chaotic, incomprehensible readings. "Report," Hall shouted, her voice sharp, but she was struggling to maintain control of herself, let alone her crew. "The pulse. It's—" Faro cut off abruptly, his eyes widening. "It's inside the ship. It's not just affecting our minds anymore, Captain. It's affecting the very structure of the Excalibur. The hull's integrity is breaking down in places. It's warping space around us." Hall's heart skipped a beat. The situation had escalated beyond her worst fears. The pulse wasn't just manipulating their perceptions. It was altering the very space they occupied. It was changing their reality. "We can't break free," Carson said, his voice strained as he struggled to make sense of the ship's systems. "We're trapped. The gravity's fluctuating, and I can't stabilize the environment. We're at its mercy now." Farah's eyes widened in horror. "Captain, it's not just the ship. It's us. It's trying to change us, reshape us. Whatever it is, it's not only calling us, it's trying to merge with us." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a brief moment, Hall could feel a pulse trying to invade her own mind, to crack open the barrier she had spent years building. It was seductive, this presence. The abyss was alive, and it wanted them. It wanted all of them. Hall gritted her teeth and fought the growing panic clawing at her insides. "We're not giving in to it. We push forward. Steady, everyone. We're not leaving until we understand what this is." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her voice. Could they truly understand it? Could they escape this invisible force that had already claimed their ship and their minds? The deeper they went into the abyss, the harder it became to separate their own thoughts from the dark influence around them. Faro, his hands shaking, turned to Hall. "Captain, do you hear it? It's whispering, calling us. I can't focus. I can't think straight." Hall nodded grimly, fighting the sensation in her own mind. "Stay with me, Doctor. You're stronger than this. Focus." Just then, the ship's communications system flickered on, an unexpected voice coming through the static. "This is Commander Lucius Vallon of the Solitude. If you can hear me, Captain, listen closely. The abyss you're descending into, it's not just a phenomenon, it's a sentient being. And it has one purpose, to devour everything it encounters. Do not approach it. It will take you, and it will never let you go." Hall's heart pounded as the message ended abruptly, leaving nothing but an echo of silence. She stared at the blinking communications console, struggling to digest the implications of the warning. The abyss wasn't just a place, it was a predator. And they were its prey. The message from Commander Lucius Vallon hung in the air like a heavy fog, pressing down on Captain Hall and her crew. For a long moment, the ship was silent, save for the hum of the abyss outside and the laboured breaths of the crew as they tried to comprehend the warning they had just received. The Excalibur seemed to pulse in response, its very presence vibrating with the weight of its unknown fate. Did we just hear that?" Faro whispered, his voice trembling as his gaze remained fixed on the communications console. "Was that real?" Hall swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had no answers, but the sudden sense of urgency flooded through her like a surge of electricity. The abyss, whatever it was not only alive, it was hunting them. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They were not exploring an unknown region of space. They were trapped in the grasp of an ancient, malevolent force that had swallowed countless others before them. "Prepare to engage emergency protocols," Hall ordered, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her insides. "We need to leave now. Reverse course." The ship shuddered violently, cutting her off. The lights flickered, plunging the control room into an eerie half-darkness before coming back on in a dim, unstable glow. The floor beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as if the ship was being drawn further into the abyss. "Captain, it's too late," Carson said in a strained voice, his hands frantically working at the control panel. But the readings only became more chaotic. "We've been locked into its gravitational pull. There's no way to escape now." Hall's heart sank. She knew Carson was right. They were no longer in control of the Excalibur. It was as if the abyss had wrapped its tendrils around the ship, slowly crushing all their hopes of retreat. Every attempt to break free only pulled them deeper, as though the very fabric of space around them was shifting to keep them in place. Farah was staring at his screens, his eyes wide with horror. "Captain, the pulse is becoming more invasive. It's not just affecting the ship anymore. It's affecting our bodies, our minds. We're being rewritten, altered." Hall clenched her fists, fighting the overwhelming panic threatening to take hold. She could feel it too, the suffocating presence, the whispering voices clawing at the edges of her consciousness. It was subtle at first, but now it was clear. The abyss was not just an external force. It was inside them, slowly dissolving the boundaries between themselves and the entity that had trapped them. "We need to fight this," she said, her voice sharp, commanding. "Everyone, focus. Block it out. We've survived worse, and we will survive this." But her words felt hollow in the face of the growing terror. The crew was beginning to unravel, their movements slow and disjointed as they struggled to maintain control of their minds. Farah's hands trembled over his console as his pupils dilated unnaturally, and Carson looked up with empty, vacant eyes, his jaw slack. "Captain," Carson muttered, his voice strange, as if he were speaking through a fog. I can hear it. It's asking us to join it." Hall's breath caught in her throat. It was happening. The abyss was trying to absorb them. It wasn't content with merely trapping them. It wanted to consume them completely, body and soul. "No," she said firmly, her voice gaining strength despite the fear that gripped her. "We will not join it. We will not let it take us." But even as she spoke, Hall felt her own thoughts begin to blur. The abyss was a living thing, a vast, endless entity that communicated not through words, but through emotions and sensations, directly into their very beings. It was showing them their darkest fears, their deepest desires. It was reshaping their minds, bending them to its will. Her vision began to distort, the walls of the Excalibur warping like liquid. She saw flickers of images, familiar faces, long-lost friends and family, all beckoning her. The abyss was using her memories, her longing, to pull her in. "Captain, you have tow." Pharaoh's voice cut off as his body began to convulse violently, as if he were being torn apart from within. He fell to the ground, his mouth open in a silent scream. Hall rushed to his side, but the moment she touched him, a surge of cold washed over her. She pulled back in horror as she realized Pharaoh's body was no longer entirely human. His skin seemed to stretch unnaturally, his eyes wide and vacant, the whites of his pupils swirling with the same strange, shifting colors that surrounded them. The abyss had already begun to claim him. "Pharaoh," Hall shouted, but her voice felt distant, as though she were shouting from the other side of a great divide. But it was no use. Pharaoh's form began to disintegrate into dark tendrils of energy, dissolving into the pulse of the abyss. Terror surged through Hall, but she couldn't look away. The abyss was not just an external threat. It was inside them, and it was changing them, transforming them into something else, something they were never meant to be. The dark whispers grew louder, and Hall realized with dawning horror that it was no longer just about survival. It was about surrender. The Excalibur had entered the abyss, and there was no way back. Captain Hall staggered back from Pharaoh's disintegrating form, her chest heaving as the gravity of the situation crushed her. Her heart raced as she fought to keep her focus. The whispering grew louder, relentless, crawling through the walls of the Excalibur, seeping into the very fibers of her being. She could feel the presence, the force, burrowing into her mind, tugging at her will, urging her to give in. "No," she whispered, clenching her fists. "I will not join it." Her mind screamed for clarity, but all around her, the Excalibur felt as though it was unraveling. The walls stretched and warped as though they were made of taffy, and the faintest tremors in the ship's structure hinted at the ship's growing fragility. Whatever the abyss was, it was reshaping everything within its reach, not just the crew, but the ship itself. Carson stumbled toward her, his eyes wide and glassy, his movements slow, almost mechanical. "Captain, you feel it too, don't you?" His voice was hollow, as though it were no longer his own. "It's beautiful, Hall. It's calling us home." Hall recoiled, her stomach twisting in horror. "No, Carson. Don't listen to it. It's not real." But he wasn't hearing her anymore. His lips curled into a strange, empty smile as his body seemed to flicker, shifting between human form and something else, something dark and alien. It was as though the abyss was rewriting him, erasing the person he had once been. She could see it now. His essence was being warped, twisted into something not quite human, something far beyond the reach of her comprehension. His body flickered one final time, and then he collapsed, his form disintegrating into shadows, absorbed by the dark pulse. "Captain," Farah's voice echoed in her mind, faint but insistent. "It's already too late. We're part of it now." Hall fought to maintain control, to keep her senses from slipping away completely. She felt her own body grow heavier, as if the air itself had turned to lead. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, mixing with the distorted whispers that filled the ship. The pulse of the abyss. This entity was inside her, in every thought, every fiber of her being. "Stay strong. Stay human," she whispered to herself. She forced her hands to the control panel, ignoring the tremor that ran through her fingers. She had to regain control of the ship, but the systems were unresponsive. Everything was slipping through her fingers. She could feel the abyss creeping into her every action, her every decision, her every moment. The ship's hull groaned as the reality around her bent and twisted, and she could sense the familiar hum of the Excalibur becoming distorted foreign. Then she heard a voice, not through the ship's communication system, but inside her head. It was low, soothing, impossibly calm. "You cannot resist us. You never could. You belong to us, just like everyone else. You are part of the void. You are the abyss." Hall's blood ran cold as the voice echoed in her mind. She could feel it trying to take her, to smother her with its promises of peace, of unity, of dissolution. The voice of the abyss. Its presence was everywhere now, inside her, wrapping around her thoughts like an inescapable chain. But she would not surrender. She clenched her teeth, fighting the crushing pressure in her mind. She had to think. She had to act. She couldn't let the ship fall into this thing's grip, couldn't let her crew, what was left of them, become one with this entity. "Captain Hall," a familiar voice broke through the fog of despair, sharp and insistent. It was Ryan, her second in command, but her voice was strained distant. "You're still with us. You You have to fight it, Hull. You can still fight. Hull's eyes snapped open as if waking from a dream. Ryan's voice was a lifeline. She wasn't alone. There was still someone else, still a part of her humanity that wasn't lost. Her mind sharpened with renewed clarity as she realized the truth. This wasn't just about the abyss, not anymore. The entity was feeding on their fears, their doubts, their weaknesses. It wanted them to surrender, but the power to fight it, to resist, still lay within them. "You're right," Hall breathed. "We're not alone. We will not become part of this. Not today." Her hands moved quickly now, working through the chaos of the systems, searching for anything that could help them break free. She had to find a way to disable the gravitational pull, to sever the connection that the abyss had established with the Excalibur. The ship was alive with the pulse, its hum vibrating through every part of her body. But Hall fought back against the overwhelming sensation of being drowned, of losing herself to the darkness. Her thoughts sharpened. She thought of Earth, of the people they had left behind. She thought of her crew, what they had sacrificed to get here, to face the unknown. They could not, would not, let the abyss claim them. "I will save us," she whispered, her voice steady and firm. "We will survive. I won't let it take us." Her fingers found a switch. She pressed it. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then the Excalibur jolted, and the dark hum of the abyss began to wane, as if the entity itself was recoiling. The pull weakened, and Hall felt herself breathe again. But it wasn't over. The abyss would not let them go that easily. The Excalibur was free, at least for now, but the shadow of the abyss still loomed waiting. The silence was deafening. For the first time in what felt like days, the Excalibur floated in an eerie stillness. Hall's heart thudded painfully in her chest, the pounding in her ears a constant reminder of the ordeal she had just survived. The ship's internal systems flickered back to life slowly, the faint hum of its engines a weak counterpoint to the silence that hung in the air. They had broken free, for now. But Hall knew it wouldn't last. The abyss was not so easily shaken off. "Captain." Ryan's voice, still weak and strained, filled the quiet, breaking her focus. Hall turned to her second in command, whose face was pale, eyes wide with lingering fear. Ryan's fingers clutched the edge of the console as she steadied herself. What do we do now? The pulse is still out there. It's just waiting for us to slip." Hall swallowed hard, staring out into the vast expanse of darkness beyond the Excalibur. The blackness of space was almost a relief after the suffocating presence of the abyss, but she knew better than to let the calm exterior fool her. They were still within its reach. Whatever it was, whatever force controlled this uncharted region of space, it wouldn't give up. Not until it had them. "We can't go back to Earth yet," Hall said, her voice low but resolute. "Not until we're sure it's safe. We need to figure out what the hell this thing is, and how to destroy it. We can't just run for it forever." Ryan nodded grimly. "We'll need more data. The Excalibur is still scanning, but the readings, they're off. Like there's something wrong with the laws of physics themselves." Hall turned away from the viewport and moved toward the tactical console. The crew, what was left of them, were slowly recovering, but the strain on their minds was evident. Carson was gone, and Farrow. She didn't dare think of what had happened to him. The abyss had already claimed them, their bodies becoming twisted mockeries of themselves. Only a handful of them remained, but their minds had been ravaged. "They're coming back online," Ryan said, her voice breaking through Hall's thoughts. "Slowly, but the crew. We'll need them to pull together if we're going to survive this." Hull turned to face her second-in-command, determination flaring in her eyes. "We will survive this. We have to. I'm not letting it take any more of us." The silence returned, but this time it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of stillness that signaled the calm before the storm. Hull could feel it. The pull of the abyss was still there, like an invisible tether, threading through the very fabric of space around them. A low, rhythmic pulse echoed through the ship once more. Hull's spine stiffened as the lights flickered again, and for a moment she thought she could hear something, a faint whisper rising from the depths of space. The same voices, the same invitation. But this time they were different. It was no longer a single voice, but many, a chorus of whispers coiling around her thoughts. The pull was stronger now, like a physical force tugging at her very being. Her pulse quickened as her breath caught in her throat. The abyss wasn't letting go. "Captain," Ryan shouted, breaking the trance that was slowly taking hold of Hull. "It's happening again. The Excalibur, it's shaking. It's being pulled back in." Hull's hands flew to the console as she fought to regain control. The ship shuddered violently beneath her, and the gravitational force grew stronger, more oppressive, as though some unseen hand was squeezing the life out of the Excalibur. "Engage reverse thrusters," Hull barked, slamming her fist on the command panel. "We need to break free. Now." The engines roared to life, but the abyss was too strong. The force pulling them toward it was like nothing they had ever encountered before. Hull's chest tightened as she watched the ship's speed readings plummet, their efforts to escape rendered useless by the entity's overwhelming power. "Hull," Ryan said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, "we can't fight it. Not like this." "No," Hull snapped, her voice hard. "We won't just give up. We're not the ones who surrender." Her eyes swept the room, locking on every member of the remaining crew. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear, but Hull saw something more, a glimmer of defiance in their eyes. They might be broken, they might be battered, but they were still fighting, and so was she. With a trembling hand, Hull activated a long-dormant emergency protocol, a final defense system designed for moments like this. The Excalibur wasn't just a ship. It was an experiment in advanced technology, a vessel that could withstand impossible conditions. Hull hoped it would be enough. "Hold on," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the increasing hum of the abyss's influence. She could feel the pull grow stronger with every passing second, but the ship was fighting back. Its systems were designed to endure, and Hull refused to let the abyss claim them. But as the thrusters roared and the ship's core began to glow with a fierce energy, Hull realized that this might not be enough. The abyss was a living force, an ancient intelligence, and it wasn't content with simply pulling them in. It wanted them broken. The Excalibur shuddered once more, and the ship lurched forward, as if it were being dragged into the heart of darkness. Hull's grip tightened on the console. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But with every passing second, she knew, whatever came next, they had to face it together. The Excalibur groaned under the strain, its hull shuddering violently as the abyss's pull intensified. The ship's once pristine structure now felt like a fragile shell, buckling under the weight of an ancient force far beyond its design. Hull's eyes darted from one console to the next, watching the systems flicker in and out of life. It was a race against time now, and the odds were stacked against them. The whispers grew louder, swirling through the ship like a tangible presence. Hull could hear them, feel them crawling through her thoughts. They were no longer distant voices, but a chorus, a unison of hunger and yearning that seemed to reach deep into her very soul. The abyss was closing in, its embrace inevitable. "We can't hold on much longer," Ryan said, her voice strained with fear, but there was something else. Something in her tone that was resolute, like a final acceptance of what was to come. "It's too strong. We're already inside it." Hall clenched her jaw, refusing to give in. She had to believe there was a way out. She had to believe that they could escape. Her hand hovered over the emergency override controls, the ones that could release the ship's core energy in a last-ditch effort to break free. It was their only hope, but it would come with a heavy cost. The Excalibur wouldn't survive the release. The crew might not either. But as the whispers reached a fever pitch, Hall knew there was no other choice. They couldn't just wait to be consumed. "Captain," a voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. Lieutenant Sullivan, one of the few crew members still functioning. "There's another way." Hall turned to face him, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you talking about?" Sullivan's face was pale, his eyes wild with something that could only be described as a mix of awe and terror. "There's a dormant relay within the ship's core, something I've been studying. It's linked to the abyss, somehow. It's been here since we first encountered this space, and I think it's what's allowing it to pull us in. If we can reverse the relay, we might be able to sever the connection. But, Hall pressed, stepping toward him. "The problem is, we'd have to channel the core's entire power into it," Sullivan said, his voice tight. "It's a one-way ticket. Once we do that, there's no going back." Hall's mind raced. She looked back at Ryan, who met her gaze with a heavy nod. This was the moment, the final choice. She could feel the pull of the abyss growing stronger with every second, could feel the ship itself losing its fight against it. If they didn't act now, there would be nothing left to save. "Do it," Hall said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "We'll give it everything we have." Sullivan didn't hesitate. He ran to the control panel, fingers flying over the keys, working quickly to activate the dormant relay. The ship shuddered again, more violently than before, as the pulse of the abyss surged through the walls, choking the life out of everything. The core thrummed with energy, its power surging as Sullivan's fingers pressed the final command. And then, for a moment, everything stopped. The whispers, gone. The pull, the pressure, suddenly disappeared. Hall's breath caught in her throat as she realized what had just happened. The abyss was retreating. The Excalibur hung motionless in the void, its systems flickering back to life as the energy from the relay stabilized the ship. It was as if the very fabric of space around them had snapped back into place, the unnatural force receding. But Sullivan's face was pale, his lips trembling. He looked up at Hall with wide eyes, and she could see the truth in them. The cost had been high. The ship was safe, but at what price? Hall's heart sank as she watched Sullivan collapse to his knees. The energy needed to sever the abyss's hold on them had drained him, drained all of them. The ship's core was barely functioning, its power reserves depleted, leaving them stranded in the darkness of space. We did it," Sullivan whispered, his voice barely audible. "But we won't survive much longer. The core's drained, and there's no backup power." Hall's gaze swept over the remaining crew. They were alive, barely, but their faces were filled with the same hollow recognition of the choice they had made. They had stopped the abyss, but it had cost them everything. "We didn't give up," Hall said softly, her voice resolute, though her heart ached. "We didn't let it take us." The ship was adrift, no longer controlled by the abyss, but by the crew's indomitable will. But as Hall stood there, feeling the weight of their survival settle on her shoulders, she couldn't shake the feeling that the abyss had only just begun to reveal its true power. it had been driven back, for now, but there was no telling what consequences their defiance would bring. As the Excalibur drifted in the vastness of space, Hall knew one thing for certain: their fight wasn't over. The Abyss would return, and next time it might not let them escape so easily. But until that day came, they would stand together. They would survive. And humanity would never bow to the darkness.